All right, so as I was just saying, this is going to be a very, very fun workshop, and it's going to take us into the future, actually. Well, into the future relative to the previous two workshops, because in this workshop, we're going to not just look at Caravaggio's early works, we're going to look at a very transitional period in Caravaggio's career. So after 1605, Caravaggio's painting takes quite a turn stylistically. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to be looking at what happens when Caravaggio leaves Rome suddenly in 1606. And then we're going to discuss what he was doing when he left Rome and ended up in Naples, and then in Malta, and then in Sicily, and then back in Naples before his premature death in 1610. So welcome to the workshop. We're going to be looking at some different work today, as I mentioned, and I suppose the point of today's workshop is to show the difference between the early works and his more mature works, and look at how his networks of patronage supported him in times of trouble, and look more closely at how painting from life and working directly from life and from nature set Caravaggio apart from other painters during his time. Now, there were other dominant painters in Rome. There's the Caro brothers and the Carracci brothers, especially Annibale Carracci. And Caravaggio seems to even belong to a different era to them, even though they're his contemporaries. And we'll discuss a little bit about that tonight. All right, so let's get into it then. And I'm going to give an extended introduction while we're looking at the first painting. All right, so here we have St. John the Baptist painted here, and he is fully nude. This is an interesting painting in Caravaggio's still early works, essentially, because we're only in 1602. This is a point in his career where he has become one of the leading artists in Rome, probably the most famous artist in Rome, because of his completion of the Contarelli Chapel paintings, the St. Matthew paintings, the calling of St. Matthew, the martyrdom of St. Matthew, and the vision of St. Matthew, or St. Matthew with the angel. And the unveiling of those paintings, those canvases, in the opening years of the 17th century really consolidated Caravaggio's station as the most groundbreaking and also controversial and striking artist in Rome at that time. And that commission, the completion of that commission, was really the culmination of the networks of patronage that Caravaggio had really built for himself through people like Cardinal del Monte, who I've been talking about over the last two sessions. So the St. Matthew paintings really did establish Caravaggio as a leading artist in Rome, and they made his reputation more widespread. They were his first major public commission, or his first public commission, and they set a trend for Caravaggio, wherein he would fulfill several public commissions throughout his career from then on. This is a small private commission. This isn't one of those public commissions, but this is a very important private commission, which came after the completion of the St. Matthew paintings, which I was just talking about. Just like the Supper at Emmaus, which we did look at last week, this painting is commissioned by the same brother within the Mattei family, the very, very wealthy banking family, the Mattei. This is commissioned by them. And it has a similar, stylistic feel to the Supper at Emmaus. But what makes this a fundamentally distinct painting, although it is still a religious painting and a devotional painting, it has a far greater sense of ambiguity than the Supper at Emmaus, because we have a nude St. John. And whenever there's a nude involved in a painting, it brings a lot of meanings associated with the nude into the artwork. And Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, which you're all very well aware of, we've done lots of workshops on Michelangelo, provided the inspiration for the nude in this painting. There is an ignudo on the Cappella Sistina ceiling, and Caravaggio drew inspiration from one of them. Okay, so Michelangelo's working with the nude was very different to Caravaggio's. Caravaggio's ignudi on the Sistine Chapel are idealized. They're idealized in a really extreme Neoplatonic way, because what Michelangelo wanted to do was to show the perfection of God's creation of man. Okay, what Michelangelo wanted to do in his ignudi for the Sistine Chapel was show the divine hands of God at work, and show us, the congregation, the perfection of the most perfect form that humanity could physically take. He didn't work those paintings, he didn't paint those paintings of the ignudi from life. He worked them up from countless drawings. You know, in Vasari's biography of Michelangelo, which didn't make Michelangelo very happy, or at least the first edition didn't make Michelangelo very happy at all, Vasari revealed that Michelangelo spent a lot of time drawing and putting in great labors into working the designs of his nudes and of his various other designs. Michelangelo's ignudi were fundamentally highly worked up designs which took from life what Michelangelo needed, which drew from the life model a basis, but then injected Michelangelo's own creative vision into the design. Life models would have served a very important purpose, and they probably wouldn't have been life models, because life modeling wasn't a profession in the Renaissance. Michelangelo and various other artists had people nude in the studio who belonged in the studio as assistants, and they may have had people who posed often in the studio because they provided a good physical exemplar with their bodies from which to draw. And that was common practice in the Renaissance for a workshop assistant or an apprentice to pose in the nude or semi-nude. You wouldn't have a professional life model come into the studio in the Renaissance and come and do the session and then leave. That wasn't how it worked. Someone had to be there nude when the artist needed to do their drawings, and someone would be told to pose and hold a pose. If you look at Renaissance drawings of nudes, you can see that they are executed from figures in the workshops. If you look at Maso Finiguera's drawings, you can see that workshop people within the workshop were subjects for drawings. If you look at Francesco Granacci's drawings from when he was well, after the time that he was trained by Domenico Ghirlandaio, you can see that he's drawing people around him in the workshop. And so people in the workshop would provide visual material from which to draw. Now, Michelangelo's drawing, so if we go back to Michelangelo and his ignudi for the Sistine Chapel, he would make countless drawings from life and then work up those drawings from memory, embellish them, perfect them. And by the time he's ready to paint, he's got a folio of drawings and a set of exemplar drawings that are quite removed from the initial life drawing, because he's invented so much, he's manipulated the design so much, and he's honed it into a design which is really a product of his creative endeavor and his creative labor. It's a product of his invention. It's a product of his fantasia, which combines knowledge and memory and imagination. So the life model is involved and observation is involved. But artists in Michelangelo's time and during the Renaissance, which is before Caravaggio, artists were trained to utilize their fantasia and to draw from their own intellectual reserves. They memorized various different body parts, and they memorized the rules of Vitruvian proportion, and they memorized a plurality of different figurative designs even, which they could just execute from memory. That was fundamental to Renaissance training in drawing and Renaissance art education. It involves the life model and it involves drawing from nature, but it fundamentally hinges upon the artist's capacity to invent and the artist's capacity to model and manipulate images using their own intellect and imagination. Caravaggio has done none of that in this painting. He has worked directly from life. He has not manipulated the pose. What we see in this painting is a form of life painting. What distinguishes this from Renaissance painting and Manneristic painting is that Caravaggio's work from the figure is mimetic. It actually mimics life in a way that Renaissance figurative design doesn't. Michelangelo's paintings are not mimetic. They're inventive and they're creative. That isn't to say that Caravaggio's painting here is not inventive. It's incredibly inventive and it's remarkably creative, but it's mimetic in the sense that it is literally copied from life, down to each cast shadow, down to each reflection of light in the highlights on that spine of his scapula there, on his acromion, on his lateral malleolus there, on his calf, on his medial condyle there, although that's the top of his quadricep. The medial condyle is there, but there's a little bit of reflected light there on the medial condyle. So this is mimetic. He's drawing from life. He's painting from life. He isn't inventing a pose. The drawing or the design isn't adapted out of a creative journey of invention. It's drawn or taken from life itself. And that's what really makes Caravaggio's work very different. This is Caravaggio's second known nude. He may have painted nudes earlier, but the first full figure nude that we have is Amor Victorious, that wonderful painting of Cupid standing nude with musical instruments and still life behind him. And then we have this painting, which is his second known full nude, and it's a St. John. So the two early nudes are a Cupid, which is a pagan theme, an allegory of love. It's an allegorical or a pagan mythological painting, very fashionable in Caravaggio's time. And then we have this religious devotional painting. Okay, so I've gone rather I've rather strayed from my notes, and so I just need to find my place. I got excited and don't know where I am. I mean, maybe I should just forget the notes and just follow the strand of thought, but I feel obliged because there were some important things about this painting which I think you ought to know, which I did write down. So this painting is from 1602, as you can see. And in this workshop today, we're going to look at Caravaggio's paintings from 1602 up until 1609, which is the year before he died. There are paintings that he did paint between 1609 and 1610. We've got one of them in the National Gallery in London, and it's Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist. And Caravaggio's last works. We're going to look at very late paintings, but we're not going to look at any paintings from 1610. We'll save that for another workshop, but we are going to learn about Caravaggio's life right up until 1610, which is when he died. We've seen his early paintings in Rome, and we have seen already in weeks 1 and 2, Caravaggio combining different genres of painting in one canvas. If you cast your mind back to the Musicians, which was commissioned by Cardinal del Monte, it was an allegory of music with those 3 young boys playing music, up to, bust height or sort of half length figures. But there was also a Cupid in that painting with his full quiver of arrows, and he's holding a bunch of grapes. And so this combines an allegory of love with an allegory of music, with a pagan subject, with Cupid there. And so he would combine genre painting with allegorical paintings. And with his self-portrait as Bacchus, that's a mythological painting, but it's also a self-portrait. So it's combining portraiture and indeed self-portraiture with allegorical paintings or mythological painting. With his fortune teller and with the card sharps, I haven't shown you the card sharps yet, but with the fortune teller, which we have looked at, he's combining genre painting with everyday Roman life, the coarseness, the grittiness of life in his contemporary Rome. So he is a painter who is exploring the possibilities within combining different genres of painting within one canvas. We know that a lot of his early collectors, his early collectors were Cardinal del Monte, the Mattei brothers, but also one of his teachers, Cavaliere d'Arpino. And Cavaliere d'Arpino was an important painter, an important artist in Rome during Caravaggio's lifetime. And he also was an admirer of his protege's work. I don't know if it's actually fair to call Caravaggio a protege of Cavaliere d'Arpino, because d'Arpino was an admirer of Caravaggio's work. I think that it's fairer to call Cardinal del Monte call Caravaggio a protege of Cardinal del Monte, because Cardinal del Monte was a patron who did an awful lot for Caravaggio, establishing networks of patronage for him and also defending him and intervening when Caravaggio was in legal trouble, which he often was because of his temperament and his behavior and he wanted to carry a sword like all of us, but he wanted to carry a sword, and in his time, as it is now, it was illegal to carry a sword unless you had a right to do so. And in order to have a right to carry a sword, you had to be a member of the aristocracy, or a knight, or a man at arms. And Caravaggio was none of those things. He was a famous artist, and that did not qualify him or give him the right to bear arms in any context, I don't think. In 1606, he actually ran someone through and murdered them, which we are going to discuss later, and you're going to learn about that. So look forward to hearing about the gritty, violent bits. And that's what caused him to have to leave Rome in 1606. Suddenly, in the late summer of 1606, Caravaggio had to literally flee Rome. And it was the Colonna family who enabled safe passage for him to Naples, because they were another of the sort of important patrons who had housed him and who had protected him during his life in Rome between 1592 and 1606. That's Caravaggio's Roman period. After that, he's in Naples, he's in Malta, Sicily, then back in Naples before he dies. And I suppose his most productive time is really those early years in Rome, although he is incredibly productive in Naples. He paints several works in Naples in the space of a year. which is really remarkable. So yeah, we're doing really well, actually. We've covered quite a lot of really interesting points about Caravaggio, and I want to talk about another commission that Caravaggio did fulfill in between the Contarelli Chapel commission, which is the 3 St. Matthew paintings, and this painting. So another public commission had come after the, not surprisingly, after the Contarelli Chapel, because those St. Matthew paintings were incredibly successful and made him incredibly famous. They were criticized for being too realistic. Like I was talking about with Caravaggio working from the nude, working from the nude from life, it was expected that artists would actually have some design of their own, that drawings and paintings weren't, just taken directly from life, but there was some invention and fantasia imbued into the painting, so that the painter had invented something. Take, for example, Sophonis Anguissola's amazing drawing of the boy bitten by a crab or a crayfish. Now, she was praised for having invented various expressions. You can't draw that expression from life because it's such a fleeting thing. Her little brother could not have held that facial expression. And so she had to call upon her memory and her own capacity to design a representation of these expressions. And it's that design aspect, the inventiveness within the design of Renaissance drawing, was what artists were prayed for. And Caravaggio outright refused to do that. He painted from life, and he captured life in a very immediate and direct way, rather than relying on his capacity of designing from his own intellect. And there is tremendous creativity in what he did, but it isn't the same. And he was criticized for that in those Contarelli Chapel paintings, as he was for his next major public commission, which is another of the major public commissions of Caravaggio's life, which was the commission basically at the same time that Caravaggio was commissioned to paint the side paintings in Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. He painted the Crucifixion of St. Peter, and he painted the Conversion of St. Paul. These are 2 remarkable paintings. You probably know them. The one of the martyrdom, the Crucifixion of St. Peter. St. Peter's being crucified upside down, and his skin is all suntanned, and his feet are like sticking out at you. And he's got different complexions in his skin. No one had ever even dreamt of doing that before Caravaggio. That is painting from life. And that is painting the brutal facts of life into a painting. And no one had even imagined doing that before him. And that's something he was criticized for, because this is a divine subject, and you're supposed to elevate and supposed to idealize divine subjects. That's what was in accordance with the ideology and theory of art, or the ideologies, I don't know if that's the right word, but the philosophy or the expectations that artists were considered to be ought to fulfill. And he basically refused to idealize his subjects. He painted them directly from life as they were. He included people who looked like peasants in paintings, people who looked like they'd just been dragged off the street, and they would make numerous appearances in various paintings by Caravaggio. He'd use the same person a number of times because he liked painting them, or thought that they were compelling or interesting. He didn't idealize his subjects, and it was considered at the time by various people, artists included, who criticized him. They criticized him for not giving adequate decorum to divine subjects, painted them as though they were happening in real life, and in a rather direct way. which wasn't seen as tactful or tasteful. It was seen as vulgar, some of it. You know, having dirty cloth, you know, having dirty feet. You know, he'd paint dirty feet, he'd paint suntanned skin, which, you know, shows that someone's been out in the sun working, unless they have a natural tan like me. And although I have been out in the sun, and which has been wonderful lately because it's been beautiful. And he'd paint ordinary bedding, you know, sort of ordinary familiar sheets and ordinary everyday objects. So, you know, and this does tie in with what we were talking about last week with his infusion of ideas from the Lombard school, which he was brought up in. Obviously, he was trained by a great Lombard painter. Well, he was originally from Bergamo and trained in Venice. It was Simone Peterzano who trained Caravaggio, first of all, and he absorbed a great Lombard tradition. Now, in the workshop of Cavaliere da Arpino, he would have become familiar with even more artwork, not just being in Rome and being able to go and explore the Sistine Chapel, as he's evidently done here. You know, as you can evidently see in this painting, because this is taken from a pose of an ignudi, but he's painted it as though the pose is actually real, as opposed to the idealized pose in Michelangelo's painting. He's painted it from life as though it's real. If we take a closer look, we can actually see that. What I'm going to do now is actually zoom in a bit, so that you know, you should have sketched the whole figure by now, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom in to here to there, so that you can do a more focused drawing of the face, the torso, and the ram, who's got big horns. Now, it's unusual for a painting of St. John, because St. John is normally painted with a little innocent sheep, lamb, but here he's got a big horny ram with him, which is very, very peculiar and breaks with convention, as everything else that Caravaggio does, as does everything else that Caravaggio ever did. So, yeah, so these paintings which he painted for the Cesare Chapel, the Chiesari Chapel in the Santa Maria del Popolo, even the first paintings that Caravaggio delivered were rejected. He had to do them again, and they were very controversial, and yet they were admired by various different members of the elite. So he's very controversial, very divisive painter in this time. Okay, so at the turn of the early years of the 17th century, he's a very controversial painter, very divisive. People like Mario del Monte and the Mattei brothers love him, adore him. They house him and they look after him, and they commission numerous works from him, and they collect his paintings. But he ruffles a lot of feathers, because he does things that have not been done before, and he does things like paint from life, and he doesn't idealize, he doesn't give adequate decorum to divine subjects. He does things that painters think, and that convention says painters ought not to do. Why aren't you inventing something you're on your own? Why are you just painting from life? Anyone can do that. That's what people may have said. People may have said, you're not using your invention, you're not actually designing anything, you're not actually creating anything, you're just painting from life, you're just copying. And so a lot of painters who were trained in Manneristic painters in the late 16th century and the early years of the 17th century, going into the Baroque era, the early Baroque era, painters may have felt that, why is Caravaggio getting these commissions? Why is he so famous? He's not fulfilling his duty as a painter. He's just painting the model. He's just painting from life. There isn't the art isn't actually there, because he's not using invention. He's not idealizing. He's not actually creating or he's not actually inventing anything. So that's one of the reasons why he's quite controversial, or very controversial in his time. But it's also a reason why his paintings are so strikingly different and so strikingly atmospheric. And it's also why they changed the course of art forever. Look at the cast shadows on St. John's face, even the locks of hair casting individual cast shadows. Wouldn't have been dreamt of before. Completely remarkable. So, as I had mentioned earlier, this painting, this St. John the Baptist, painted in 1602, it was just like the Supper at Emmaus, which we looked at last week, that wonderful Supper at Emmaus, which is now in the National Gallery in London. This was also painted for the Marchese Ciriaco Mattei, one of the brothers of the Mattei, the famous and wealthy bankers. So it's a private commission, a devotional painting. And as I mentioned, it is inspired by a particular Michelangelo ignudo. What I'll do is next time we do a Caravaggio workshop, I'll include that and show it to you. I have been pinging up more images in the slides of late in recent weeks, and I've been really enjoying doing that, but I wanted to keep today's workshop very, very simple and straightforward to allow for more fluid drawing. And because I completely bombarded you in the previous workshop with too much stuff and made you and dizzied you with lots and lots of stimulation. So yeah, we've got this amazing ram with big horns. Now, this is clearly das naturale, from nature, from life, and it's obviously been executed with great immediacy and directness to create, well, and in doing so has created a very theatrical scene. And in this painting, we can see that St. John is not, yeah, he's borrowed from Michelangelo, but he's actually engaging the viewer in a very ambiguous way, which might have caused some, well, I mean, it's a private commission, so it's not a public painting. And I think I think this could never have been a public commission for a church. It would have been an absolute no. If he'd have come to I finished your painting and turned up with that, the Cardinals would have literally, I don't know, they would have probably had an accident in their in their sort of person, and I think you can guess what I mean. They so this is obviously a private commission, could never have been a public artwork in a church or anything like that, because it is too sexy, it's too erotic, it's too direct, and it engages the viewer in a very, very charged and dynamic way, just like the Lombard painters that Caravaggio learned so much from as a youngster. The painting really does engage the viewer in an emotional dialogue, and by emotional we can include the passions and the hungers and the desires, and there's something deeply erotic in this painting, the way that he is embracing the ram and then turning towards us with his hips turning, and his legs are in a very much in a state of flux, because that left knee is rolling forward in a very relaxed way. There's no tension in that leg. What's his right leg doing again? Yeah, his right leg is quite firm, quite rigid, as though he's about to push off it. There's tension in that, so that right leg is causing a sense of movement, which makes us feel like he really is turning towards us to interact with us. And that's one of the traits that we saw in Lombard painting last week, to engage the viewer in a dynamic exchange. And we can see that the chiaroscuro here is very, very stark, very deep, very dramatic, to create a sense of intimacy here with this subject, with St. John here, a sense of intimacy. So in a dark and enclosed private environment with this nude figure here of St. John. So very, very, I mean, he's really pushing it in this painting. It's daring, it's very daring. Another thing that enhances the intimacy is the fact that if we do glance back at the full painting, I mean, that painting is in all about that figure. There is no sort of bigger picture going on. It is a small painting, it's just under 1 meter across, and, you know, under 1.5 meters, you know, top to bottom. And the nude basically fills the dimensions. And so we are up close, you know, we're not far, we're not distant, we're not remote from him. Think about that Supper at Emmaus painting and how last week we compared it. You must, if you haven't seen last week's workshop, look at it on YouTube, because we compare Titian's Supper at Emmaus to Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, and look at how Caravaggio takes us so much closer to the scene. And it's exactly what he's doing here in this painting, just shortly after completing the Supper at Emmaus canvas. Okay, so he brings us right up close to this nude figure, something that would have appeared as really novel at that time, and it is really novel. Caravaggio is a real inventor. He's one of the contributors of the invention of still life, for example. But also here in these paintings, the intimate nude. I mean, we've seen the nude evolve in previous workshops from Giorgione with his Sleeping Venus from 1510, and we've looked at Titian's remarkable exploration of the nude in painting. Obviously, Michelangelo with the recent series we did on Michelangelo on the symbolic body was, you know, largely about the nude. But Caravaggio's approach to the nude, in these two paintings I've spoken about, in this painting here, the St. John, but also Love Victorious, Amor Victorious, the nude is engaging with the viewer in a completely different way, in a very, very engaging and emotionally engaging way, and a passionately engaging way, which involves sexuality and involves real eroticism. So he may have even used the same model as the Cupid. Maybe we need to look at that in Amor Victorious. I think it could even be the same boy who posed for both paintings. I wonder what, I haven't come across anything in the scholarship that discusses that. The scholars do agree broadly that Caravaggio used people in one painting and would then paint them again in another painting. So people he liked, people he liked the look of, he would paint time and again in various different paintings. And I think my feeling at the moment is that this could be one, because this boy is very much similar. It's like it's Cupid transformed into Saint John. It's the personification of erotic love transfigured into St. John the Baptist. And it's almost as though Cupid has left his painting and entered this painting, but here is disguised theatrically as St. John. It carries all of that erotic energy with it into somewhere where it had never been before, into a depiction of St. John in the wilderness. And if you compare this to, you know, an earlier painting of St. John in the wilderness, it's completely remarkable. There is also, you know, another difference in John in the wilderness would be Leonardo's one, where St. John is sitting down, pointing up to heaven, where St. John is alone in quite a dark background. There is quite stark chiaroscuro, as is, you know, usual for Leonardo. Leonardo was a great painter with chiaroscuro as well, but obviously painted with far more. I mean, his paintings are very invented. You know, he doesn't paint from life. You know, no one looks like the Mona Lisa. It might be derived from a drawing that may have began with studies from life, but it certainly didn't end up as a painting from life. It, you know, took on a lot of Leonardo's philosophy and experimentation. But there is also, you know, he is echoing Leonardo to a certain extent here. All right, so yeah, we've really spoken about Caravaggio and his response to Michelangelo. It's almost a critique of Michelangelo by painting a similar pose but from life instead of from invention. And it's also taking the erotic energy from his love victorious into an entirely different, into the religiously devotional domain during the Catholic Reformation, which is astonishing. And in some degree, this painting does conform to the requirements of the Catholic Reformation, because Catholic Reformation wanted painters to engage with an emotional dialogue between viewer and the subject within the painting. If you cast your mind back to last week and when we looked at Pertezzano's painting, that sort of Christ praying in the garden, it wants to evoke emotions. It wants us to see our religious archetypes in a state of emotion, so that it humanizes them and makes us feel the universal sort of truth of what they went through, the sort of religious and theological significance of what they went through, but in a way that we can understand, because it telegraphs emotions that we are familiar with, because they're universally human as well as universally sacred in the case of the prototype being Christ or Mary or St. John. And so Caravaggio is doing that here, but he's engaging a different sort of emotion. He is also, painting very naturalistically to the point of realism. I'm not sure that, the Catholic Reformation certainly didn't, during the Catholic Reformation, painters did start to paint more realistically, more naturalistically, but that was, because of Caravaggio's influence as well, not just because of the ethical requirements of the Catholic Reformation. In this painting, we've also got a sense of there's also the everyday objects like the sheets, which don't look too grubby in this painting, and other paintings they do. But it's just someone who looks like they've stepped into the painting from everyday life. It's just the elements of everyday life are really him. It's a real nude person, and that's the other sort of Lombard element that has found its way into the painting, being something from everyday life, painted naturalistically as though it were real. So how are we doing for time? How much have I taken up with this painting? Loads of time. I've already taken up too much time. We need to move on, everyone. So you've drawn this for long enough now. So I hope you've got a nice sense of that sort of beautiful accented shadow at the contour of the deltoids there. They are the spinal fibers of the deltoid. They're connected. You see he's painting from life, and he's really understand. He doesn't need to. Well, it helps if you do know about anatomy, but when you're working directly from life, you can just see everything there, can't you? And so you don't need to invent these things. It does help to know these things so that you see a lot better. Actually, when you're working from life, you actually see things a lot more clearly, because your mind understands what's going on underneath the surface, and you can see that you need to connect this deltoid to the spine of the scapula and to the acromion, and on the anterior side of the deltoid, that needs to be connected to the clavicle, okay, because you've got 3 different fibers of deltoid there, and you can kind of see that fiber of the deltoid is connected, those fibers of the deltoid are connected to the spine of the scapula. We've also got his rib cage, his beautiful rib cage, all the way down to he's at the 10th or 11th rib. We've got 11th and 12th rib down there, perhaps. And we've got the acis, the iliac crest here, and that fossa made by the greater trochanter there as his femur is turning outwards towards us. That is pulling in the greater trochanter and creating that dip there, that concavity there. Okay. We've got the 7th cervical vertebra there, that little highlight there. And the tone, the light and dark, the chiaroscuro, the tonal modeling on the body is what illuminates all of this the structure and fabric and mass of the human body. It so clearly worked from life. One of the things that he took from Giorgione is this ability to, or this approach to painting that had no reliance on drawing, didn't rely on an underdrawing. We don't know if Giorgione painted from life. He probably didn't. He probably did work from drawings. He probably did establish his designs first. I mean, he would have worked up a design for, if we look at Il Tempesta, for example, one of Giorgione's greatest paintings, one of the greatest paintings of all time, one of the most ambiguous paintings, one of the most debated paintings, one of the paintings that generates the most scholarly interest and also interest from artists. The Tempest, you know, he probably did work up a design for it before painting it, but painted onto the canvas without drawing on the canvas first. This painting seems to have just been painted directly from life without any pre-existing drawings at all, but just painted directly from the life model there in the studio. That's a big departure, which we already know about. Okay, so let's move on now. We need to go forward in time. We need to see what happened, what Caravaggio was doing later on in his Roman period. Okay, so we can go up to here now. So 1605, 1606, look at that, St. Jerome. What an extraordinary thing. What I'm going to do is actually, I mean, look at that, sketch it quickly, but in a couple of minutes, in a minute or 2 minutes, I'm going to go here, okay? So that you can look closer and look at his face, look at his hand, look at that hand, and look at the skull, okay? And incorporate all of that into your drawing. So sketch the full thing, and then we're going to look more closely. That will be really fun for you. So this is Caravaggio at a more mature stage in his career. He has been continually in trouble. He's been arrested several times by this point. He's about to be charged for murder. Okay, so in the year 1606, he is actually charged for murder because he does actually murder someone. And this is painted during a time in his life where he is at, you know, really, you know, he is slightly out of control, but he gets away with a lot because he has friends in very high places, cardinals and, you know, wealthy aristocrats. And at that point, he's about, well, he's born in 1571. And so it makes him 30, so 36, 36, 37. No, 35, 34, 35, 36, 35, something like that, mid-30s. And yeah, right in the middle of his 30s, he is at this point. So we've got St. Jerome here, and you can see how literally black the background is. It's very dark, very dramatic, this painting. And by this point, his process and his style has been really evolving. You know, it's a long time now since he became a very famous artist. We've had the Contarelli commission, we've had the Santa Maria del Popolo commission with the crucifixion of St. Peter and the conversion of St. Paul. Now we can see more sincere, emotional, devotional, and spiritual paintings emerging in Caravaggio's work. Think about the Taking of Christ, the amazing canvas which is in Dublin, the National Gallery of Art, the National Gallery in Dublin, the National Gallery of Ireland, sorry, which is in Dublin. The Taking of Christ, where Judas is kissing Christ, that is so spiritually powerful, that painting. Christ in a state of, he looks like he's in ecstasy, but as I've often said, as you've probably heard me say before, ecstasy and agony look very similar. They're expressed in very similar ways, and perhaps they're not too far from each other either. they might be just completely, they're like polar opposites that have kind of met each other on the other side. It's like, it's like they're polar opposites that have kind of come close together. It's like people say that about politics, don't they? They say that if you go far enough left and another person goes far enough to the right, they end up being, national socialists. They end up being sort of, and national socialists and extreme, Bolsheviks and communists are basically, they're not too far. They're both equally violent. They're equally, destructive and self-destructive, and they're equally, they're basically both equally communistic and equally fascistic when they go right to the very extreme of their political ideology. So I think that with agony and ecstasy as well, they might actually come all the way. It might be so, so powerful, the feeling of ecstasy, that it is a state of agony as well, because it's too much ecstasy. Or, if you think about Christ's passion, he's being taught, he's being crucified, but the relief of that, and he knew that he was going to have that fate, and the relief of it coming to an end would have been a state of ecstasy. And there's that wonderful, in the Uffizi in Florence, they have that amazing lithopite head of Alexander, the dying Alexander, where he is dying and taking his last breath, and it is an image of human ecstasy and agony. You look at that beautiful Pontormo drawing. It's a design, it's a study for, now this is an example of Renaissance artists taking and then reinventing. Pontormo used the head of Alexander, the lithopite head of Alexander, as a model for a St. Joseph. And he used that sculpture as the basis for that drawing, and then for the drawing for the painting. But his painting just looks like, his drawing doesn't really look like the head, but you can see that it's taken from the head. Renaissance artists didn't really always copy things. They weren't mimetic in the way that Caravaggio is, and it was. And but when you show someone that drawing, they know that that is an expression of just human agony. But it's also looks, in the sculpture looks like ecstasy. So they're almost, and that's something that Caravaggio had started to explore. And the spirituality around ecstasy and agony was something that Caravaggio started to become quite interested in. He was quite a tormented man. He was, people don't go out and commit, don't assault people and lose their temper and end up killing people in a brawl and end up being assaulted and then being arrested for carrying weapons you're not allowed to be. If you're not, you don't do that sort of thing unless maybe something terrible had happened in your life. I'm not going to start psychoanalyzing, I'm not nowhere near going to start psychoanalyzing anyone at all ever, but I'm not going to start sort of going down a Freudian route with Caravaggio. But you don't behave in that way unless you're troubled, or you're not, or maybe you just have an innately criminal mindset, which maybe some people do. And so Caravaggio is while at the same time his behavior is getting out of control and he's about to murder someone, he is also exploring the relationship between agony and ecstasy in painting. And this painting is so spiritual, it's so intimate, it's so quiet, it's actually very peaceful, and it depicts Saint Jerome at study. Saint Jerome is the saint who is celebrated for the translation of the Vulgate Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, into the Vulgate Bible, and that's the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, which those of you who are Catholics will know very well. And so he's here at work, and that was a feat of extraordinary intellectual dexterity and intellectual discipline, and also just pure intellectual capacity. And so he is depicting that. He's depicting that inner world, that inner experience of working in that way. Beautiful red drapery, typically Caravaggio-esque red drapery, very striking, takes up, you know, almost a quarter of the painting. And there's the white sheet on the table. The still life looks like it's just been set up. That skull is looking very precarious there. That skull, which is a memento mori. He's combining the depiction of Saint Jerome, the ascetic hermit scholar, with an image of him as the great intellectual hero of Christendom in a very clever way here. And the skull is that memento mori, which is always a symbol, that ever-present symbol of, oh gosh, I've got to take you closer to the skull, haven't I? Sorry about that. That reminds you that, you know, death is always sort of, you know, it's an ever-present factor of life. You know, we are born knowing that we'll die. So unlike the halo in the Supper at Emmaus, the first Supper at Emmaus, there was a second Supper at Emmaus, which Caravaggio painted sometime just after this. Actually, he painted another Supper at Emmaus in he painted another amazing Supper at Emmaus in 1606, just after he murdered Ranuccio Tomassoni, the guy he murdered. Wow, we've got to look at that painting next time. Caravaggio is just one of the greatest painters ever. I love it. I absolutely love this. Yeah, so he painted a series of very, very interesting paintings in between the previous painting we've looked at, the St. John, and this painting, the St. Jerome. He'd painting the taking of Christ, which I've been talking about. He painted the sacrifice of Isaac, the crowning of thorns, and the amazing entombment, the entombment of Christ, where he took again from Michelangelo, but took from Michelangelo's Pietà, with Christ's limp body being sort of laid down into the tomb. And he looks really, really dead. And he's also got the tension in the right shoulder there. That's another painting we must look at in the next series that we do in Caravaggio, on Caravaggio. And when that will be kind of, you know, I don't know, I have to get a sense of how much it's wanted. There's lots of things I want to do with drawing from history before we do Caravaggio again. So it might be sometime. Maybe next year we'll do a series on Caravaggio again. I'm sure you'd all like that. And so, yeah, and also the Death of the Virgin. The Death of the Virgin was a painting that Caravaggio painted before this one, which was extremely, extremely controversial, because he had taken, you know, it's something that, you know, wasn't a very popular scene to begin with, but he painted the Virgin dead, and she looked like she had swollen up, and it was, the idea that Caravaggio had painted had been inspired by a dead prostitute who had been pulled out of the Arno, the River Arno, and decided to use that image, the image of a swollen, drowned woman, as the model for the dead virgin. That was like something that showed absolute, that really offended people. So Caravaggio was controversial, not just for painting religious figures, and like here we've got Saint Jerome with sunburnt hands, for example. That's remarkable. It's realism. It's painting these things. No idealism here. No, he's not perfecting the form of these figures. He's painting them as though they're someone who's just stepped into the studio. And but so this was controversial. But to paint the Virgin Mary in that way was actually theologically offensive. And it kind of, I think, while this was the case, it didn't mean that people within the clergy didn't actually really love and support him, and even buy his works. His works, while this was the case, while he was very controversial and sometimes even offensive, you know, I mean, that would offend, you know, some people would be offended by that today. And, you know, people from very religious backgrounds are often really offended by various different images, aren't they? We all know recent things that have happened in France and, you know, over the last decade, you know, people who offended, if you touch on someone's religious sensitivities, they can really react in a really inordinate and exuberant way. Fortunately, Caravaggio wasn't murdered for offending people's religious sensibilities. But what's interesting is that the love for Caravaggio and the fact that many within the church hierarchy actually championed Caravaggio and defended him and intervened when he was in trouble shows how dynamic and intelligent many within the church actually were. And the fact that they wouldn't, you know, when someone offends you, it's kind of quite dignified to act in a passive way, isn't it? You don't have to sort of carry out, you know, you don't have to kick up a fuss about it. you don't have to. And you know, you might, you know, there might be a reason to say something in response to challenge it, but for the church hierarchy for many within the church hierarchy, and including popes and future popes and cardinals, to actually champion Caravaggio, to collect his work, even when for many people his work was on the border of committing a sort of theological offense or undermining the spiritual message of aspects of Christianity. He, you know, that shows that there's a great level of sophistication in the traditional structures of European culture, including the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not a Catholic, but the fact that many within the Catholic hierarchy supported Caravaggio at this time shows that they at least had some sense about something. And, you know, I'm not someone who criticizes Western culture. I'm not someone who sort of goes out of my way to criticize Western culture for various different things that happened in the past. I like to show positive things. I'm really inspired by traditional Western art and culture and heritage, and I'm not making a defense of it either. I'm just talking about the complexity of these topics. I know that very often we hear lots of condemnation of traditional Western culture and traditional Western and European institutions, and we always it's becoming increasingly common to hear people from all different walks of life and backgrounds saying very critical things about Western institutions and traditional Western culture and, you know, Western culture itself and its language. But I think that things are far too complicated to get away with that, really. I think that the history, when you really look at the history, it's full of surprises that show the dynamic and complex nature of Western culture and its traditional institutions, including the Catholic Church. And so it just won't do to just be entirely negative about things all the time. So yeah, I obviously clearly love Western traditional Western art and culture. That's what this whole project is devoted to, and that's what I want people to participate in and to draw power from. And I think that anyone, you know, anyone from any background at all can derive tremendous empowerment and creative stimulation and encouragement and much needed, you know, nourishment, cultural nourishment from interacting with traditional Western art and culture in an open-minded way. So St. Jerome, what did I actually write down about this painting? So yeah, it was painted towards the end of Caravaggio's time in Rome. In 1606, Caravaggio murdered Ranuccio Tomassoni. Ranuccio Tomassoni was quite a wealthy man. He was a very connected man, and it was a step too far for Caravaggio to have murdered him. It was, if you murdered someone, you would be punished. Okay, so while cardinals and high-ranking friends, members of nobility who support Caravaggio, they can intervene when he assaults someone, when he maybe sort of cheats or steals or carries a sword, they can seek pardon for him. But when he actually murders someone, that's too far. And in an outburst of rage, Caravaggio murdered someone, and it really was the wrong man, because Tomassoni was a very well-connected guy. And so he fled from Rome. It was the Colonna family who helped Caravaggio find passage to Naples in the summer of 1606. And so in that time where Caravaggio was essentially in hiding, when he was essentially in hiding, he did actually still continue to paint while in Rome, including the Supper at Emmaus painting that I mentioned earlier. And this painting and the paintings of this era between 1505 and 1506 is a time in Caravaggio's career where his paintings are really beginning to mature, and his paintings take on a more devotional and spiritual bent or complexion, or there's a deeper sense of atmosphere, there's a deeper sense of religiosity to them. And there's an irony there, because this is when this is when his life takes a real kind of negative turn. It's really interesting. So he's maturing as an artist at this point. And so when he murders Tomassoni, as I mentioned, it's the Colonna family who established his route to Naples. And in Naples, when he arrives in the summer of 1606, he arrives as a famous artist. And the Colonna also have networks in Naples, which is outside of the jurisdiction of the Roman authorities. And so what happens is Caravaggio takes passage to Naples and is immediately welcomed as a famous artist, and is given a number of various different commissions. So one of the most famous and important, one of the most brilliant paintings, another painting for us to look at in the next series on Caravaggio, is the 7 acts of charity, or is it the seven acts of mercy from 1606 and 1607. Caravaggio paints the 7 acts of mercy, and it's totally unbelievable, that painting. It is electric. There are figures falling about, falling off the canvas. It's like looking into, I've never been to Naples. I haven't been to Naples yet. I will go, and I must go, and I can't wait to go, and I really want to go soon. But the people I know who have been to Naples and told me about Naples, and the documentaries I've seen, and the books I've looked at, which show you what Naples looks like, it looks amazing, fascinating, brilliant. And to me, that painting looks as though you're looking down a busy, congested street in the middle of the night when everyone's out on a debauch, and that's the painting. It's really mesmerizing and impressive and remarkable. And that, to me, for me, it really shows us how creative Caravaggio was to incorporate life into art, and in that way. And it opens up an entirely new vision for art in these years, this painting included, because he shows how much invention and creativity there is in approaching painting in a different way. As I've mentioned, we're in the Renaissance, and the Mannerists, the Mannerists who were still contemporary in Caravaggio's time, and the early Baroque painters who were very much working within the legacy of Mannerism, like the Carracci and the Zuccari, famous painters in Rome at the time of Caravaggio. These guys were still drawing in a tradition which was becoming academic. You had the Accademia de San Luca in Rome, and you had the Accademia del Disegno in Florence. So you had the rise of the beginnings of academicism in the second half of the 16th century. But with these painters, they're still working within a very Renaissance framework about design. Renaissance disegno, design, drawing in the Renaissance has all of these qualities which I mentioned at the very beginning, such as invention and memory and fantasia. The artist has to actually create something new based on drawings, and to design something using a number of drawings. If you ever went to there is a Caravaggio exhibition on at the moment, but one of the previous Raphael, sorry, did I say Caravaggio? I meant to say Caravaggio. There is a Raphael exhibition on at the moment at the National Gallery in London, but a previous Raphael exhibition at the Ashmolean in Oxford about 5 or 6 years ago, it was a very good exhibition at showing the progression of the design stage and really opening up what disegno really meant in the Renaissance. And this is very much the legacy which the artists in Caravaggio's time are still working within, which is to take a design, a drawing which may have been based on from life, and then adapt it and model it and remodel it and rework it and refine it into something that is quite remote from the original drawing that was taken from nature, from life, into something that the artist has essentially created out of their own vision in conjunction with studying nature. That's the paradigm of Renaissance disegno. Caravaggio is working on a completely different paradigm. He isn't interested in disegno. He's just dal natura. It's all about life. It's all about painting directly from life and not really designing anything. But there is still massive creativity in what he does. It's ridiculous to think, he opens up a different avenue of creativity. And just thinking of the 7 Acts of Mercy, it showcases the extent to which this approach can be creative, because he creates a living scene which is convincing but is at the same time phantasmagorical, with all of these figures. He makes these elevated ideas and these allegorical and universal ideas of the 7 mercies, the 7 Acts of Mercy, and the moral depth and intellectual endeavor of what St. Jerome is doing here. He makes it, he takes something so sacred and so elevated and expresses it through what can be experienced in real life. We're not sure exactly why he murdered him, but it was apparently over a card game or something like that in a bar. So that's an answer to Rian's question about why he murdered that bloke. So yeah, he's an absolutely remarkable creative genius. All right, so I've barely looked at these notes, and I'm slightly worried that we're not going out awry, are we? No, I think there's probably lots on here that I haven't actually mentioned, but I think it's going okay, isn't it? So let's move on shortly. I'm going to show you another painting, one of the late paintings by Caravaggio, a commission which he received while in Malta. We haven't looked at anything from Naples, and we haven't looked at anything from Sicily, but what we are going to look at is something from Malta. He went to Naples. I mentioned the 7 Acts of Mercy, which was one of the first commissions he executed there. We're going to talk a little bit about Malta, because it's a very interesting period in Caravaggio's life when he's in Malta, because he actually becomes a member of a aristocratic order, and he becomes a member of the Knights of St. John of Malta, which is you know, an order of chivalry which still exists today. And Caravaggio becomes a sort of a member, a very lesser rank within that order of knighthood. He subsequently has his position taken off him. He's expelled from the order because he assaults a more senior member of the order. Why? I just wish he'd lived longer to do more paintings and didn't do these ridiculous things. But it must have been difficult for him being so outlandishly brilliant. I mean, he was just such a, I mean, he's one off. Caravaggio is a complete one off. There'll never be another Caravaggio. He's a completely unique figure in the history of art. He's one of the most brilliant painters, and I love him. I absolutely love him. I think he's brilliant. He's just such an outstanding artist. All right, so we are going to look at another painting, and we're going to look at another painting, and then we're going to finish. So this is the painting. We're not going to look close up because I want you to sketch the whole thing. It's a very late painting by Caravaggio, 1609, a year before he dies. And let's talk a little bit about that while you're sketching this in. It's an amazing piece, actually. And the Virgin Mary there is painted in such a dignified way. Nothing like the earlier paintings. She actually does look, she doesn't look quite idealized. It's unfinished, isn't it? You can see. I mean, the surroundings, the bedding, this, you know, the bedding, you can't see whether the bedding's clean or not, it's too shadowy. But this Annunciation it's so wonderful. And the reason I chose this painting is because it shows Caravaggio very late in his career, late in his life. Okay, he's still a young man, you know, so it's terrible, you know, it's terrible that he died so young, but he is painting in here, painting the subject, which was the most Renaissance subject you can imagine, the Annunciation. Everyone from, you know, Donatello with his Cavalcanti Annunciation, Leonardo, he painted at least one Annunciation scene. Botticelli painted an infamous Annunciation, which Leonardo hated. He said it looked like Leonardo had a sense of humor, actually. He said that Botticelli's Annunciation looked like the Virgin Mary sort of like leaping away from a terrifying Gabriel. So, you know, lots of artists painted Annunciations. It's a ubiquitous subject in galleries around the world. When you go to look at Renaissance paintings, you'll probably see an Annunciation. And here is Caravaggio doing one. Very late in his life. Late in his life, even though he was a young man. He didn't know he was going to die at this point. He was probably ill, though. He was probably ill quite a lot. Probably carrying lots of illnesses with him because of all of his behavior. And here we've got an Annunciation. It's a typical archetypal Renaissance subject. And he has chosen to actually emulate a very traditional aesthetic for Mary, a very Renaissance-y aesthetic for Mary. It's almost like Fra Filippo Lippi, Virgin adoring the child, although the child hasn't been born yet because we're still at the Annunciation. The child's born in 9 months from now. And so Gabriel's telling her that she's going to fall pregnant with the Son of God, and that she's going to raise the Man of Sorrows, and that she's the one that God's chosen to bear his child. And that's the moment, and she's gripped with feeling, as you would be, and Gabriel is appearing on a cloud like that, looking physically real. It's just amazing to see Caravaggio dealing with this traditional subject. It's a very, very traditional subject in his own way, you know, and actually harmonizing his approach with the tradition, with the traditional approach, because the Virgin is depicted there in a way which wouldn't be so alien in a Manneristic painting. I actually did a drawing of a virgin kneeling down like that recently. It's in my sketchbook. This is my current sketchbook. Don't often see my drawings anymore, do you? That's one that I did. Kneeling Madonna there. And but that is drawn from a Verrocchio drawing. And that is a similar pose and similarly draped and similarly, poised as that Caravaggio painting. Okay, so Caravaggio is actually really showing an awareness and an affinity with the older tradition, which he had moved so far away from. That's why I chose this painting to show at the end, because it shows that discourse, and it shows that after all, Caravaggio is a member of this great canon, and that he is, while he is on the outside of this great canon, he is still, and he's an outsider within that canon, he is still a part of this overall development of European painting from the Renaissance into what is now the Baroque. We've even got the Gabriel holding a lily like that, a symbol of purity, a symbol of purity and a symbol of faith, but mainly purity, the white lily. Perhaps saying that she's of pure faith, and so that's why she's been chosen. So therefore, within the remit of Catholic reform, the morality of Catholic reform. There's so much in this painting. I think I'm going to leave it there. I think I've said enough, and I think I'll just give you a little bit of time to draw. And yeah. So yeah, they received the commission in 1608, completed this in 1609. And before I do end, actually, I'm not finished yet. I've got to tell you about how he died. So Caravaggio completed several paintings in Naples before leaving for Malta in 1607. He receives this commission in 1608, completes it in 1609. In Malta, he was welcomed by the Order of St. John and was made a Knight of Grace. I've already mentioned this. He entered the knightly order of the Knights of St. John of Malta, but then he did actually assault another member who was way more senior than him, and was expelled from the order and then put in prison. He escaped and ended up in Sicily in 1608. Within a year, he was back in Naples in 1609, and he wanted to get back to Rome. He had all of his most well-established networks of patronage were in Rome. The Mattei, the Cardinal del Monte, the Colonna. Rome was where he came of age. It's where he established himself. His patrons in Rome were trying to negotiate for a pardon so that Caravaggio could come back without being put to death. And while that was being worked out, Caravaggio was making his way incrementally back to Rome, and he went to Port Urco, but was imprisoned there wrongly, by mistake even. And when the officials who arrested him released him, Caravaggio saw that all of his belongings were already on the ship leaving, and which included, a number of works, paintings that ended up in the Port d'Arcole, which he lost. And he became very ill and died in 1610. He became very unwell and died of a fever. At the age, 1610, so it would have been almost 40, like 39, 40 perhaps. So that's Caravaggio's life, man. Like, it totally transformed art forever, and was such a brilliant artist. And love him forever. He's one of our best. He's one of our best. All right, so I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'll stop the recording, but I'll let you draw for a bit longer, okay? So I'll do that. All right, fantastic. I hope you enjoyed everything. All right, so there we are.